Today, I'd like to talk to you about the strategies in the China-US trade war. These strategies can be divided into long-term and medium-short-term ones, and also into what we call the fundamental principles and the tactics. We'll discuss it from the perspectives of both China and the United States. It might sound a bit complicated, but just think about it. On one hand, Trump has been inconsistent in his actions recently, right? On the other hand, we have quickly counterattacked. Then, after facing the consequences of our counterattack, Trump has made rapid adjustments. And most countries around the world have, to some extent, lowered their stance and tried to communicate privately with the United States. The United States seems to have a certain degree of control over these countries in private dealings. However, when it comes to China, the United States sometimes, so to speak, appears to back down a bit. Meanwhile, we, on one hand, are strengthening the integration of domestic and foreign trade. On the other hand, our national leaders have taken the initiative to reach out in both Europe and Southeast Asia. So, as we often say, we are playing a big strategic game, and this is exactly that big game. Since it's a big strategic game, the ultimate solution to it must be a political one, rather than a so-called commercial solution. Of course, in this process, in the short and medium term, at the tactical and strategic levels, commerce may play a certain role. But the ultimate solution will definitely lie in the political and strategic aspects. Okay, let me make a long story short and explain it step by step. First, let's talk about the short term. As you all know from the recent news, our Chinese leader arrived in Vietnam on the 14th. The visit lasted for 2 days, and today, he is set to leave Vietnam and head to Malaysia. In the following 2 days, he is expected to visit Cambodia. As I mentioned last time, these three countries have different relationships with China. Vietnam has a more complex relationship initially. Malaysia has been trying to balance between different sides, and Cambodia is relatively peaceful and friendly towards China. During this period, there are several points you need to pay attention to. On April 14th yesterday, US Treasury Secretary Bessent revealed in a media interview that they had started negotiating foreign trade with Vietnam last week. It can be said that Vietnam was among the first batch of countries to negotiate with the United States after the so-called Liberation Day April 2nd, when the US proposed reciprocal tariffs. However, he didn't disclose whether the negotiations had been completed. Then, it was said that the United States would start negotiating with Japan today, the 15th, and with South Korea next week. Now, there are two questions regarding Vietnam and the United States. First, have they successfully reached an agreement in the negotiations? Second, if they have, what are the details of the agreement? To be honest, both the United States and Vietnam have been very secretive about this so far. My many years of experience in journalism tell me that the more secretive a situation is, the more likely there are hidden stories behind it. We just don't know exactly what those hidden stories are for now. However, South Korea has already started to reveal some information. South Korea said that it is willing to use the large-scale procurement of US energy as a bargaining chip to persuade the United States to ease the high tariffs imposed on South Korea. Theoretically, currently, the United States has given all countries, except China, a 90-day grace period. But what will happen after these 90 days, or 3 months? Bessent said a few days ago that he hopes the negotiations can be completed in May or June. If not, the latest deadline should be July. South Korea hopes to reach a no deal with the United States between May and July. In this way, by purchasing a large amount of US energy, South Korea can get the United States to relax the tariffs, which will save its automotive industry. Vietnam doesn't have such a strong automotive industry as South Korea. Its main focus is on trade. And this is just my speculation, but it's possible that the United States will use Vietnam to put pressure on China. At the same time, the United States may also strengthen its military and political cooperation with Vietnam. Vietnam and the United States have completely different ideological and political systems. However, in terms of geopolitical strategy, Vietnam has always been a strategically important area, whether it was during the Cold War when it was a key area for the Soviet Union or now for the United States. The US strategists will definitely not give up on it, and of course, China won't either. As I told you a few years ago, in addition to the long history of conflicts and friendships between China and Vietnam, we share the same political system, and our mutual dependence is significant. Of course, there are also many close cultural ties between us. Now, let's talk about the economic interdependence between the two countries. Approximately 30% of all the products that Vietnam imports from abroad come from China, and at least 18% of its exports go to China. There are also some entrepot trades involved. So, China is undoubtedly Vietnam's largest trading partner, and the economic interdependence between the two countries is extremely strong. It's not easy for the United States to take advantage of this situation or even sow discord to sever the complex and deeply intertwined economic and trade relationship between China and Vietnam. Well, yesterday, when our Chinese leader arrived in Vietnam, he had already published an article in a Vietnamese newspaper before the arrival. On the day of his arrival in Vietnam yesterday, he met with the top two leaders of the Communist Party of Vietnam, which shows that the visit was of a rather high specification. So far, at least more than 40 economic and trade cooperation agreements have been signed between the two sides. Therefore, in this sense, we still believe and hope that our Vietnamese friends, amidst this complex historical situation, can understand that as a small country, it's understandable for Vietnam to adopt a strategy of hedging its bets or seeking survival. As long as it doesn't harm China's interests, it's acceptable. In terms of geography and culture, which country is closer to Vietnam, the United States or China? To be honest, this is not only a problem that Vietnam faces, but also a common issue for almost all East Asian countries. In this regard, I once suggested that at the current stage, we should temporarily play down the strategic conflicts in the South China Sea when dealing with East Asian countries. Of course, the more we try to play it down, the more likely the United States is to try to stir up trouble. So, during this process, there will be many situations that test China's strategy and wisdom. This is all about the situation regarding Vietnam. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier from a broader perspective, I've previously stated that in the short to medium term, it depends on whether we can establish small-scale multilateral cooperation. In the medium term, we need to see if both sides can find a relatively proper political solution. The medium-term political solution must come through a process of mutual gaming, especially when the United States feels the pain. I won't elaborate on this logic again as I've discussed it in previous years' commentaries. Whether it's the economic recession in the United States or the heavy blow its economic system has suffered in China's national system, it's relatively easy for the government and the people to be of one mind. That's why recently I proposed that the people should share the country's concerns and the country should safeguard the people's interests. For example, the current efforts of the Commerce Department to vigorously promote the integration of domestic and foreign trade for foreign trade enterprises are manifestations of our system's strength. However, such a system-based strength often doesn't exist in the United States. Sometimes, the American public can hardly bear the cost of economic downturns, and this will likely be reflected in next year's mid-term elections. So, I estimate that within 3 to 6 months, in the medium term, Trump will not be able to endure the trade war and there will be a moderation. But this medium-term moderation is actually just a stopover in the long-term strategic game between the two sides. So, what about the long term? I've also mentioned this in passing before. In fact, when studying Trump, yesterday I said we should study his psychology. But to study the future direction of his policies, it's more important to study his advisor, Peter Navarro, and his ideas. We won't comment on Peter Navarro's academic achievements or personal character. At least, his current so-called strategic thinking has an influence on Trump. Both Peter Navarro and Trump are obsessed with completely overhauling the free trade system established after 1945. In the past 80 years, according to them, this system has led to an increasing amount of American wealth flowing into the hands of foreign countries. In this free trade system, to a large extent, the United States has low tariffs while other countries have high tariffs, and then there's the economic system that underpins this free trade system, as well as the political order that encompasses the economic system. Of course, when it comes to the political order part, it's not a problem that can be solved during Trump's tenure. But he at least wants to address the free trade order within the economic order. In their view, It's this free trade order that has caused more and more American wealth to flow out. So, since they advocate America first and want the United States to be prioritized, all wealth must flow to the United States, and all manufacturing industries should also return to the United States. This, of course, includes aspects such as tax revenue and innovation. So, what can they do? Currently, they can't solve the problem through war, but they can launch another kind of war against the world, that is, a trade war. This is what Peter Navarro proposed to Trump, and in our opinion, it's an extremely bad idea. As the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany put it, it's doomed to failure. Interestingly, the Germans use the same language as the Chinese, saying it's doomed to failure. Because for 80 years, the free trade system has been proven effective and has, to varying degrees, improved the global prosperity level. Now, if the United States wants to overthrow it, it's obviously not feasible. Frankly, in the past 80 years, the United States has also been a beneficiary of this free trade system, not a victim. I won't go into further details on this. Well, during this process of gaming, I believe that in the end, Peter Navarro's extremely bad idea will end in complete failure. However, in this process, the short-term, medium-term, and long-term gaming are closely linked. This long-term gaming, that is, Trump's so-called doomed to failure tax policy and his so-called strategic vision of changing the global trade and economic order, I believe will bear consequences around next year's mid-term elections. Because in fact, it can't be changed. Of course, it will have a profound impact on countries around the world. The economies of various countries will be severely hit, and countries, whether in bilateral or multilateral relations, will seek reconciliation with the United States. But ultimately, it will make the United States feel the pain. This pain will first be reflected in public sentiment, whether it's price increases or economic recession. Look, as soon as Apple raised an issue recently, Trump immediately said he would consider exemptions, because Apple is a large company, and this policy harms the interests of American domestic consumers. In this case, at the latest by the mid-term elections in the second half of next year, Trump will retract his stance. He may not announce it explicitly, but he will do it secretly. In fact, this policy will end in a complete failure. However, during this process, what is the ultimate solution? This is why China took the lead in counterattacking. China is also the only country to do so at the moment. It's not that China didn't think it through, but rather that China is also playing a big strategic game. Because if you give in at this moment, you may end up becoming a second-rate country like Japan or South Korea, or at most like some European countries. Then, it will be very difficult for you to regain a leading position in the world in the future. So, at this moment, the losses endured by our various foreign trade enterprises, including the efforts of our Commerce Department to do its best to help with the transformation from foreign trade to domestic trade and the integration of domestic and foreign trade, are actually just a small part of our short-term strategies. That's why we've always emphasized that the country should safeguard the people's interests. This is actually a small part of the country's large-scale strategic game. We are not victims, rather, everyone is making certain contributions. Of course, it's also very important that the country should safeguard the people's interests. As I said earlier, in the medium term, when Trump experiences the pain of this economic recession, he may make some adjustments. This may take 3 to 6 months, or even longer. The complete failure of this policy, whether announced or recognized by the world, probably won't exceed next year's mid-term elections. We'll just have to wait and see. Of course, in the ultra-long term, the Sino-US game will definitely transcend the Trump era and will last for the next 2 to 3 decades, or even 3 to 4 decades. So, on one hand, everyone should be mentally prepared, but on the other hand, there's no need to panic. On one hand, adjustments should be made, and on the other hand, one should observe the subtle changes taking place in the overall strategic structure. If you are an entrepreneur with long-term vision, you should make full preparations and contingency plans for the long-term strategic trends in the future.